Thanks, everyone. So our first panel today will focus on case studies for telling more inclusive stories in our communities. I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Frank Mitchell. Frank is a cultural organizer in visual arts and public humanities, committed to following the histories often ignored by our monuments, civic spaces, and cultural institutions. He is the Amistad Center for Art and Culture's curator at large and curatorial advisor for the Tony N. and Wendell C. Harp Historical Museum at New Haven's Dixwell Q House. He's a consultant to the forthcoming Mystic Seaport exhibition, Entwined, Freedom, Sovereignty, and the Sea. He's also the editorial consultant for Connecticut Public Radio's Spring 2024 radio series, Unforgotten: Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery. I'm fortunate to know him in his role as vice chair of the CP Humanities Board, and I look forward to hearing this conversation.
Is that our cue?
Yeah.
Thanks, Cindy. Morning, everybody. Good morning. You guys look great out there. We were joking before we sat down that what these sorts of panels and sessions really need a little bit more of is some woo! So, yeah. In the next hour, we're gonna try and squeeze in a couple of those. It's kind of all Pee-wee's secret word. For one. So yeah, welcome. Welcome. This is Hidden in Plain Sight, Telling Inclusive Stories. I'm just gonna go ahead and read this because there's so much to coordinate here. I am Frank Mitchell, and I'm here with Steve Peters, Philippe Halbert, and Mike Keogh for this ideation session, really, that gets us all thinking about strategies for representative celebrations of the 250th. We will talk a little bit to introduce things. Then our hope is that you'll join in with us with questions and observations. So to kick it off, the Philadelphia-based photographer, William Williams, has been visiting Connecticut for the past year or so. He's working on a project of documentation and creation at Black heritage sites around the country. He's been at this work since the bicentennial, and the other day, he was describing his sites of African-American heritage in Old Lyme. Graves, historic homes, old barns, which, he reminded us, were hidden in plain sight, ready to tell their stories if we ever decided to look. It's okay if you're thinking African-American heritage sites, Old Lyme. So in this case, he is considering heritage sites associated with enslavement around Old Lyme, though his project catalogs well-preserved homes of prominent figures like the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar's house in Dayton, the Gettysburg Historic Site, and relics on properties once owned by Black abolitionists that are now strip malls. In his work, there is the historic, but there's also the contemporary, the interpretation, his 21st century practice. And it's a great reminder that all of the stories and certainly the tools can't be 250 years old. And he sort of invites us to do similar work. These anniversaries, and some of them will be up on the screen a little bit later, are the right prompt for engaging with this opportunity to see what's been actually in plain sight. And I'm trying to refrain from the more blamey rhetoric of hidden, unnamed, etc., in hopes of seeing more titles that are like, everything we've been refusing to see for 250 years. All at once, of course. So with that to kind of get us thinking about where we're headed, and certainly almost all at once, got Philippe, Steve, and Mike. And I think what I will do is invite you, Philippe, to get us started with a little introduction to who you are, what you've been doing, and to a project that you think connects us to the conversation today. And particularly how it began. I mean, how did you begin thinking about what strategies did you use to get this project started? Petra and Mike.
I do. Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. There we go. Well, it's a pleasure to meet everybody, to be on this panel. Thank you to Cindy for the invitation. My name is Philippe Halbert. I'm the Richard Koopman Associate Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Wadsworth Atheneum. And behind me is the kind of case study I'd like to lean into today, a project at the top of my list. If you've been to the museum since 1986, you will have seen this room, which is a paneled and painted room from the Wetmore House, which stands today in Middletown, Connecticut. The house was built in the mid-1740s for a local judge, Seth Wetmore, and his then third wife, Hannah Edwards, who's was the great aunt of Aaron Burr. Very connected people. It's a small world, and he was in the house when he wasn't at Yale. But fast forward to the 1980s, the family had stopped living on the property in the mid-20th century. They sold it to a Wesleyan art history professor, Sam Green, and his wife Bunny. They were good friends with Yoko Ono and John Lennon, so they also knew a lot of people. But by 1986, the house was becoming something of a, not a burden, let's say, but it was becoming difficult for the Greens, who were in their 80s. And so they started to be approached by museums looking to build their collections of period rooms. So think like the Met, which was one of those museums to approach the couple, offering to purchase the woodwork you see here. One of my predecessors at the Wadsworth, Bill Hosley, was able to approach the Greens himself and make the case, look, this is a great Connecticut thing. Wouldn't it be great if it stayed in Connecticut and could be accessible to the public? So it's a bit of an underdog story, but we beat the Met by like 3 days. And we were able to get the room installed at the museum within the year. So really no mean feat, pretty amazing for the period in time which we're talking about. And so the room has been left kind of the way you see it today, reassembled, left to be experienced as an art object, a work of architecture. It is a very beautiful space. Mid-18th century, repainted in the 1760s with this really fantastic faux graining and marbling, this landscape overmantel, a china cupboard or a beaufat for display of ceramics and glass, silver. But that's really what you get when you come to the museum today. You get kind of an empty room. It worked for a little bit, but fast forward 40 years later, just about 2026 is the 40th anniversary of our acquisition of this room. And the ways that we approach these kinds of objects has evolved, and helping us rethink this space is a series of ledgers that we purchased in 2021, found in the Wetmore House in the 20th century, sold to a local antiquarian. They came on the market in 21, and they were actually we were approached directly by the dealer, who said, you might want to take a look at these. And they've been the most illuminating source for understanding life on the estate from which this room, this house stood. It was a 2,000-acre estate called Staddle Hill that overlooked Middletown. It was an agricultural center. It was a powerhouse, quite literally, for Judge Wetmore to flex his kind of legal power. He was hearing small claims in the house, possibly in the parlor. And the most interesting thing for me has been going through these ledgers, which run 1744 to 1848, and what they tell us about the other people who lived on the grounds of this house, to include upwards of 20 enslaved people. We know that in 1778, when Wetmore died, there were 6 enslaved people on the property. They're not named, but they were given their freedom the next year. Looking at the ledgers, we're able to actually trace by name the experiences, the lives of these people, at least 5 of whom stayed on the property after being freed at the height of the American Revolution. So people like Mimbo, a young woman who we believe was purchased by Seth Wetmore and given to his daughter as something of a playmate, perhaps a lady's maid. And Mimbo stayed with the family until her death in 1828. There's Tony, for whom Seth Wetmore orders trousers in the 1760s. So, pants for doing outdoor field work. In 1779, Tony enters into an agreement with Seth Wetmore's son, He has an account in the Sun's ledger. He's no longer Tony, but he's Tony Freeman, and he's now being paid for the labor that he was forced to do during the colonial period. So these are the kinds of stories that I'm really interested in recovering from these ledgers. It kind of plays into that hidden in plain sight narrative. And the challenge is, how do we translate this for audiences in an art museum, in a room that looks like what you see behind here, where there is no really explicit evocation of those experiences, those individuals, and yet they were intimately tied to the workings of the house. The landscape you see over the fireplace, this beautiful Arcadian vision of nowhere. It doesn't really exist, although the river is maybe a nice allusion to the Connecticut right down the road. But how do we insert those figures back into that landscape figuratively, if not literally? That's the challenge. And so I look forward over the next few years thinking about how can we tell a more complete story using this room as the launch point to understand what it's like in Connecticut on the eve of independence, really lean into that 18th century moment, rethink what we think we know, and come out with a more inclusive, more holistic understanding. So I'll stop there and pass to.
Thank you. And we'll definitely come back to what kind of creativity can add to that space. And just to be clear, if somebody says Hosley again, that's definitely a woo. So from the audience, please. And next up, Steve will give us an insight into some of the work he's been doing.
Thanks a lot, Frank. I appreciate that. I also appreciate that you're trying to find stories. I'm the creative director of Smoke Signals. It's an indigenous production company. And we founded the company because we saw that there was a lack of not only stories that were being told that looked and felt like the community that I grew up in, but that also lacked that authenticity. And that was a problem. It was a problem because it hurts when you come into institutions and you see your belongings, you see your history, you see your culture, and it's marginalized. It's painful to look at. And so we created this company and we said, we need to find a way to correct that. And it was about finding stories, right? It's about hidden in plain sight, because we talk about hidden in plain sight. That for me is the community I grew up in. These stories that you talk about, this culture, what it looks like, what it smells like, I grew up in it. It's always been there for me. What it's lacked is when I step outside my community, because then it's misrepresented or it's just absent altogether. So we created this and we said, we're gonna start finding ways to allow those stories to come forward. And the first thing we had to do when we came in is we had to get our own production company. So we need our own videographers, we need our own editors, we need our writers, we need our own photographers. Now we need our own fabrication shop. So we had to open a fabrication shop a couple of years ago as well, because even down to the belongings and the frames that are made, we believe that when they're made from the communities that you're talking about, their emotion, their essence, it's there. You can feel it, you can touch it. We believe as Indigenous people, a lot of our art carries the thoughts and intentions of the person that made it, which is why when we come into institutions and we see museums interpreting our material, instead of coming back to our community and saying, how would you like to interpret this? They interpret it for us. It's painful. We can't touch it. And we see it. We know that that's our ancestors' hands that made that. And when we do touch it, it's like Linda Coombs said, and I'll never forget this, she went to the British Museum for our wampum belt exhibit we did. And she said she touched that wampum belt, and she said it was like touching the hands of her ancestors. And then my mother prayed over the belt in our language. And she started to cry because she thought, and she's like, my gosh, this has been sitting here in a dark, closed box for hundreds of years, and it has not heard its own language until today. So that's why we created the company that we did, because there was a void. And I'll tell you, we should not have been the first. And I'm not sure if we're the only Indigenous production company that's in the US, but We might be. I think we're the only one in the region. Like, we kind of joke when we talk about who we are, and people say, and we say, well, sometimes we'll say we're the largest indigenous production company in the Northeast. Sometimes we'll say we're the best. I mean, we can put anything on it because unfortunately we're the only one. So, you know, we kind of play with that, but it's at the same time, it's sad because we shouldn't be the first. It should have happened a long time ago. And I'm so glad that we have the Mashantucket Pequot Museum over there. And then we have our exhibit that we've been working on, which the Mashantucket Pequots, they stepped up and lent us materials to go in this exhibit. Because it was important that they understood what we were doing and they allowed us, they trusted us. We spent a couple of days with them and we spent a couple of days with Josh and we talked about the process that we were going through. And he understood the process because the process looks like the communities that we grew up in. And it's not just indigenous as well, because now this entwined exhibit, it actually marries both African and indigenous communities. And we followed that same process with Frank. Frank's been my partner from day one on this. And it was that process of stepping in with both African and indigenous communities that were there through the entire process. You weren't coming once a script was already written and saying, hey, can you take a look at this and tell me if I got it wrong? It was right from the beginning, say, here's the concept. Here's the concept. How should it look? What should we show? What should we tell? What shouldn't we tell? What artists do we want to feature? Because we decided, even though there's a lot of history that's told in this exhibit, it needed to be a contemporary piece. Because everything that is shown when you walk through that exhibit at Mystic is happening today in both African and indigenous communities, which is strength. It is resilience. It is rebuilding what attempted to be torn down over hundreds of years. And you see it in art. You see it in the stitching of art. You see it in the way that pottery is done, in beadwork. The fact that that retained, having had every opportunity to fail over hundreds of years, and they tried hard. I'll tell you, I mean, 250 years, that was a long, hard 250 years for some of our communities. And they tried hard to erase it, but it's still there. And so that's what these exhibits are. And when you bring the communities in the process that we're talking about, and you start bringing in production companies that are from that mindset as well, you get something beautiful at the end. So it's about the process. If you want to find the stories, you got to start with the right process. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if you did sort of like a geography tag on that. So you might want to say Cape Cod or where on Cape Cod?
Sure. I'm Mashpee Wampanoag, and our company is based in Mashpee as well.
Thank you. And now back to Hartford area. Mike?
Thank you for that, Steve. Break. Let's see. I feel like I have to share a little bit about myself. I'm the son of Cambodian genocide survivors. My parents came here for 70 hours a week. And this isn't a story about the American dream. You know, I was raised by my grandmother my entire life. We moved to 5, 6 apartments within Park Road and West Hartford and Park Street. By the time I turned 16, my parents bought their first home. And I think about what my grandma would think now when she saw me. I was awarded 40 under 40 Connecticut last year. Hometown hero in my own hometown. Community awards. Things that were so removed from her wildest dreams that were achievable, you know? And so when I think about history in plain sight, I think about who's in the room. Right now, I serve as the senior communication officer at the Hartford Foundation. I am the chair of the public campaign or the Governor's Hate Crimes Council, and I chair the public campaign awareness that will be coming out. And I was a staff member at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History as the community engagement manager. And I think about what stories are we sharing? Because the community is sharing these stories. You know, hearing you talk, I thought about the young children that grew up in Chinese restaurants are the ones that grow up in nail salons, the ones that have to find things to do for themselves because their parents are working, like my parents. My kids live wildly different lives, and sometimes I look at them. It's not jealousy, but I'm like, man, y'all don't know struggle. I grew up in a part of town where parents didn't want to drop off their kids to have play dates. It was a great part of town. I got along with all the neighborhood kids. We ran out, we played, and I would buy these things that were dubbed ghetto pops by the kids at Hall High School and KP. And they were I see one of my history teachers here. So I used to buy these pops for 25 cents and sell it to suburban kids for $5 because they would pay for it. And now my kids are growing up on that side, and I'm worried that they'll be the ones buying it. But you know, when I think about history in plain sight, I think about the joys, traumas, the conflicts that happen in these places, right? And who's in the room to share about them, to bring up uplift other voices? The kid that grows up in a Chinese restaurant. These stories are still happening. They're still there. Recently, I went to my kid's classroom and read a book about Lunar New Year's. And one of his friends raised his hands and said that for Lunar New Year's, they wait for the dad to get out of the Chinese restaurant when he closes. He stays up until midnight so they could celebrate as a family. And it felt like a powerful moment of belonging. And okay, emotional. Woo! Woo! I wish we had these moments of belonging that weren't just in cultural spaces or in affinity groups. My friend Adrian right there sent me a picture, and I'm a part of the Conservative Bears of Greater Hartford, which is a group she created, and it was a group that made me feel that I had a home for the first time in West Hartford, even though our family's been there since 1982. And what does it feel like to see these stories inside institutions? To see the Chinese education mission inside the Connecticut Museum of History? What does it feel like to see these videos of our histories and our stories? And I think I might just share one more thing that I recently did. I wear many hats. I'm sorry. When I think about community stories, I think about how do we let the community share these stories. Recently, for the foundation, I did a video on AME Zion Church in Hartford, Connecticut. This church used to be a synagogue, and when all the residents moved from Hartford, the North End, to West Hartford and the surrounding suburbs, it was bought out by AME Church. Moved in. This is a church that has been there since the Freedom Trails, and now they're on the front lines of the eviction crisis. This idea of resilience and community building and being close to the region's problems, that story is happening today. It's a different problem, but it's still there. And to allow the community to share that story, Reverend Banks, to be able to share the story in a way he felt was meaningful, instead of telling him how the story should be shared, makes everything much more powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've just begun, we're already racing the clock. Maybe we want to begin to draw you in as well, but I want to talk a bit about strategies and remind everybody of the range of stories and objects and places and venues that are in plain sight and can be part of our celebration of the 250th. If we see them and if we find ways to engage them. And I think that's where we can all weigh in on some of that. And I'd love to get questions or observations from the room as well about once we have found these places or these stories or these objects, what do we do? How do we take that first step? And how do we draw in the audience as we want? I think like your point is great, that everybody's point, people come to these venues and they see their stories. How do we create some sense of engagement so it feels as though folks who want to be consulted are consulted, and folks who want to respond in the moment can do that? So maybe I'll start there. Either of you want to jump in?
I talked about it earlier. I think process is key. And so for us, the process always starts with putting together the right committee. One, you want to make sure that your committee is comprised of people that not only are understanding the subject matter, but are also from those communities as well. And you also want to be cognizant of the size. Like you can't have a committee that is 15, 20 people and expect to be able to get to conclusions or solutions in a relatively timely way. So keep that in mind, but it's most important that you have that right group. And that's the first step that we always do with every single project we get into. The other thing that we do as well is we ask the institutions, whether it's museums, education curriculum that we're getting into as well, we ask them to let go. So we ask our clients, and that's a hard thing. We ask them to kind of let go and allow this story to be told. We're asking, especially on the museum side, I think we're asking them to do something that historically they've not done. They've always been there to interpret. And now we're coming in and saying, stop interpreting, allow the community to come in and tell that in their voice, in their image. And so that's different, but we find that process has worked, and we've been doing it since now 2012. That was our first exhibit that we did, and we immediately said we need a committee.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's, for us on the museum side, we need to sort of get our own house in order. Museums are complicated machines for many of you who have worked in them or are adjacent to them. And so the onus is in many ways is on us to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. We have the resources, the objects, the sort, whatever that is.
And an advisory council to help do this work. Seems like a strategy these guys are gently messaging. 10 to 11, it looks like. We can talk all day up here. Raheem's there doing some graphic interpretation. You guys may jump in if you have questions or suggestions or observations. Is there a mic down there somewhere? Yes, please come to the mic if you want to. If you don't want to, we'll just continue.
If anyone has a question, I'm happy to walk around and collect them and bring them up to Frank, if you could raise your hand.
Or you could shout it out if you want. Okay, what about the stories of revolutionary women all across all ethnicities, enslaved, indigenous, etc., what I refer to as not seen patriots. And there's a little bit more in here. This is why you should have jumped in and read it out. Women also showed embodied strength and resilience. Yes, that's true.
I'm not sure if that was a question or a statement, but it is a point of order. But I do want to say we've run into that a lot. So we recently did an exhibit with Pilgrim Hall Museum. It was on the women of history, and we found it was really unfortunate that the colonials they documented some really pivotal interactions, specifically with indigenous women, because in our culture we're matriarchal. And so we had women that could rise all the way to the top. Like we're very lucky and fortunate that some names like Awashanks was recorded down, but there were all these other interactions. We would just say that there was a woman that went there, and it's like she was so much more than that. She had so much more influence in that history. And so when we stepped into that exhibit, we said, well, that's something that we need to get the emotion and history across, and that there was a decision not to record her name. And so we did focus quite a bit on that. It was unfortunate, but
And I'll just add really quickly, we say Seth Wetmore. We refer to him often in reference to the parlor, but his wife was Hannah Edwards, whose brother was Jonathan Edwards, and I mentioned great aunt of Aaron Burr. Hannah Edwards is perhaps one of the best educated women in North America at the time. She's taught Greek, Latin, Hebrew. There are a lot of French books at Staddle Hill in 1778. I imagine those were perhaps a lot of hers. There's a desk in every room of the house. These are very learned people. And the Edwards papers are at Yale and the Beinecke. So we're looking at the ledgers. We're also looking at what's down at Yale. And one of the most interesting things, and I'm trying to think of a way to bring this into the story too, is Hannah Edwards, who is a little older when she marries. But right before or around the time, she pens a tract on the rights of married couples to include women and men independent of each other. And it's something of a really interesting forward-thinking tract. And it makes me wonder sort of, so this is the lady of the house, and she is this worldly woman who's finished in Boston, but educated by her minister father. And she has these ideas about the rights of women in the 1740s in Connecticut. That's a revolutionary woman before the revolution, right? And so how do we that into the story is another thing for us to think about. So I appreciate the question and to think about, yes, it's about gender, it's about race, it's about class, if we can call it that in the 18th century, but yeah.
And you could also mention your After the Revolution exhibition and the ways in which you played with gender, race, identity, class in the readings of all those artifacts. So it's totally possible to do, and you can do that with pieces that are in your collection, and it may take a little bit more research or some more imagination than you might normally bring to it, or other perspectives, but yeah, people are doing it.
Hear me?
yes.
Oh, there we go.
Not more, not necessarily a question, you have a person's story that might be of interest.
Yeah.
In the words of Horizon, can you guys hear me? So, hi, everybody. My name is Chris Barlow. I am part of the Berlin Historical Society. I'm on the board, as well as a co-founder of the Berlin Equity Action Team, which was kind of born out of some social justice and equity work in our town. Just wanted to share with the panel, and I guess with the rest of the room, that I do have a diversity story that I think is of interest to you guys specifically. We created a 15-minute short documentary film entitled The 29th Connecticut, which talks about the 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment. Specifically, we focused our film on 11 African-American men who enlisted from the town of Berlin who served in that particular regiment. Our film won Best Connecticut Film at the Mystic Film Festival last October, and we're continuing to take it on the road. We'd love to work with you guys about being able to tell that story a little bit more broadly, maybe in the Wadsworth museums as well. Just want to show that out there. Again, it's kind of a hidden in plain sight story. Most folks in the town of Berlin really don't know about the story. Lots of people in the town of Berlin don't support the story as well. It's a Black history story in a town that's really predominantly white. So we've been having some uphill battles as far as that's concerned. I definitely want to bring that to the panel, and hopefully you guys may be interested in our film and our story.
Congratulations on winning the award. And it's an American history story.
Share that out. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. And I have a question here. How can we, and this is right, thank you for that nice segue. How can we use social media and film to tell these stories? And I'm gonna have you.
So the reason why I won these awards was I created a social media campaign during the height of pandemic, and it was called I'm Not a Virus. And it asked the question, if you're not a virus, then who are you and what do you love about yourself? And I started this in March of 2020. And I photographed Asian Americans smiling right before we had the shutdown. And you know, what we did was we created a hashtag. We created these moving pieces that resonated with people. And I think for social media, I think, you know, sometimes as brands or as institutions, we kind of see them as just a way to push out events or things that we're working on. But I think what people are longing for is that sense of connection, that sense of space, that sense of being able to share their own stories through the images or the videos that you're creating. That social media campaign ended up helping advocate for the No Hate Act, which passed, and 2 Asian American Pacific Islander bills in Connecticut for inclusive education.
And thanks for that. If you are making notes, please continue. This is sort of the beginning of some focus grouping as well. So we can hold on to these and it'll guide us in how we think about some of the responses in the coming year. But I want you to say a bit about social media too, if you.
Well, I'll tell you, if you've ever been on our company's social media site, you'll know we're terrible at it. Like, we pay zero attention to social media. Video, on the other hand, is something that we do pay a lot of attention to because it's how we share emotion in our exhibits. It's how we allow people to see the human aspect of the stories that are being told. And I'm not sure we've found a better way to do that other than through video.
The next question seems to be about whether our celebrations of the 250th are focused solely on the Revolutionary era. And no, we are encouraging people to tell all kinds of stories. We really want you to think about how you can marry the historic with the contemporary. So if you've got a story that's happening in a nail salon or in a restaurant, and you can tie it to freedom, and you almost certainly can, that would be amazing. And we want to totally encourage them. Yes, there's a hand back there. Are you gonna she's bringing a microphone. And is it still Bucky?
Hello?
I know she can shout it out.
I'm the one who asked that question. I'm Cecilia Bucky from Fairfield University. My larger question was about including women, mid-19th century forward, as opposed to any activities they had during the Revolutionary period. Seems to me also a freedom question. Also just the immigrant waves that have remade Connecticut again and again that often gets lost in the focus on Yankee heritage, as well as the various minority communities that you all are representing. And I've put in a plug for the labor movement, even though it didn't officially begin getting started as an organization until the mid-19th century. You've got some earlier descriptions of activities that, Paul Revere was a silversmith, he was a master craftsman. He was actually an elite craftsman, but, there's ordinary people doing ordinary things that continue to create. the freedoms we try to remember.
And I would add Bacon's and Shay's to that. Yeah, so.
Yeah.
All relevant. We really want this celebration to be, I'm just speaking for everybody here, to be an opportunity to lift up stories of freedom throughout the centuries. Certainly not, it shouldn't be just like we did in 1976. I didn't do it then, but you know what I mean. It's a new century.
I just add also, just thinking about it as a continuum is always very helpful. And even with a project like mine, which is focused on the 18th century, and that is the reason for the season in many ways, the fact that that illuminates larger truths and it can allow us to trace a larger history of labor, of gender, of activism, as it were. I think that's also important as well, because we often think of those things as modern, but what is modern? Everything is modern when it's new. And that doing that and harnessing and taking that early on in that moment, that's also important to recognize.
And here's another one. We're going to like the more complicated tweak section. Why do you feel that personal reflections are more powerful than interpreted opinions? Personal reflections are more important or more powerful than interpreted opinions.
So one of the projects that I'm working on my own time is called Make All Memoirs. It is stories and oral histories that are told cross-generationally between kids and their parents of the refugee experience. In 2025, we'll be hitting 50 years of the war in Vietnam and the refugees coming here. And I can tell you that besides the interpreted opinions, what's happening inside these spaces are young kids around, when I say young, I mean like 30, 40-year-olds my age are learning more about their parents. And it's beginning this kind of round of healing because I'm there for all these interviews and I'm filming them. And you understand your parents a lot more. You understand why your parents made the decisions they did. And as you're raising your own kids, it gives you kind of that perspective. And I tell you, it's been an incredible experience interviewing Hmong, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnamese refugees.
And I guess I would just add, it's a both and. It's personal reflection as well as interpreted opinion to the degree that there's a huge difference there or some discrepancy. And all of that work needs to be part of how we tell these stories at this moment. Because history is constantly constructed and reconstructed. And what was written in 1872 was as much a construction as whatever we would do today. So it's a chance to continue that negotiation. Here's another one. This one's a comment. Freedom to name ourselves. Freedom is not just freedom from. There's another there. Do you want to
Hello?
shout it out?
Thank you. My name's Jean McCavin. I am the founder of History Chip, which is perfect for what we're talking about. It's a platform. It is an online archive of true stories told by anyone. Anyone in the world is invited to share a story, video, text, and can you still not hear me? Okay, I'm not good at this. So the real impetus for this was I grew up in Jim Crow, Virginia, and we were taught how happy the slaves were on the plantations and how well treated they were. And then when I grew older, I realized that no slaves were interviewed for our history textbooks. So I learned that the voices of individual people, their original stories, not their interpretations, but each person's voice was so important in history. And not just for the people who were excluded from that history, but the people who are taught that history. We are given such a disservice. And so that history that I was taught and all those children in Virginia were taught just fostered and continued to perpetuate the racism that we're still living with today. So we really reach out to every single person anywhere in the world to tell their story. I am trying to upend history so that it's not just a rich white Western stories, the histories of people in every country, people in every genre of society, disabled people, people of color, people of indigenous people, people of, plumbers, people of all different aspects of society are included.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this isn't a response to I think it's a wonderful platform that you've made. It prodded me to provide some clarification when it talks about processing committees. It's not just Indigenous communities that this applies to as well, but certainly I think it's probably the easiest example to provide. So the ancestry.com, right? People all of a sudden are doing the ancestry.com thing, and all of a sudden everyone's connected to Usumiquin. And they feel as though now they have a right to stand up on their soapbox and say, my Indigenous story matters. I'm here. And that is actually causing damage to the very existence of the tribal communities that persevered through everything to remain intact, right? The federal recognition process for Indigenous tribes is flawed. It is flawed in every single way. It is long and it is expensive. But those tribes that obtain that, there's something there that you can't discount. State recognition. Not every state provides state recognition. But again, there's a process there that shows that there's been a continuation, and they actually are. It's not that you just did your ancestry.com and you found your 8th grade grandmother had some line that went through a Native American, because at that point, all you had was Native Americans and a couple pilgrims that were coming through. So chances of those lines crossing at that point, it's like, yeah, you and 50 million other people. But nevertheless, that's why when you're putting these committees together, it's important to understand who these communities are as well. And it's not to say that if you don't have state recognition, that those Indigenous communities don't matter either, but it's that you need to know who's at the table and saying, yes, in fact, these are the right representatives. It's not because they were on social media and all of a sudden they're wearing regalia and they're doing drumming in a bar or something that's really offensive. And I've seen it, they end up on these committees for colleges, museums, state boards, simply because they've been visible. And it's deeper than that. So I just implore you, like when I talk about that process, you have to dig deeper. You have to understand that. I mean, that's the one thing when we step into any of our projects, we spend a lot of time understanding what that community is, because that committee that we put together has to be perfect.
Perfect, thank you. These questions are great. Keep them coming. And they're a reminder that there's a lot of expertise and opportunity and plenty of resources in the chairs. You guys look great. So please meet somebody you don't know, introduce yourself, give your card out. From this list, there are at least 10 really interesting partnerships for exhibitions or programs around the 250th sitting out there in these blue seats. So I hope you guys meet each other, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to do. Here's a question or two questions about children in the colonial period. Are any museums or historical societies reaching out to schools to help teachers teach students about their local history? And then insight on how to address the role of children in the colonial era workforce. So the first one is, are any museums reaching out to schools to help teachers teach students about their local history? And then
I can speak to that, at least at the Wadsworth. We do have a very robust school program. On Wednesdays is when we offer tours and programs. I'm not in education, so I'm a little less familiar, but in the sense that it's a kind of Connecticut Spaces and Places, I want to say is the name of the program, but the Wetmore Parlor is a stop. We have a lot of Charter Oak bits, as I'm sure many of you have seen. And so that's, an interesting story that cuts across colonial to the 19th century and myth and memory, place and space and identity making. So in terms of, reaching out, we certainly make that available to schools. I don't know what the current status of school trips is. I do see them on Wednesdays, but I grew up in the DC area in the wake of 9/11, so I didn't get a lot of field trips for those reasons. But I do see the buses pull up. In terms of children's experiences in the 18th century and how we're able to interpret that, in my purview of American decorative arts, I'm very eager to bring out a good cross section of our collection, not just the high style fancy things, but the more rustic everyday vernacular. And so we're actually planning a big reinstallation of our American art to 1776, planned for March of next year. And among the things I have included in our very provisional checklist are things like high chairs, things like rattles, things that speak to not only these objects as artistic objects, but a baby did shake that rattle. It probably bit the coral, a very wealthy elite baby, but the painted coastal Connecticut high chair, that's seen some wear and tear. That's not necessarily an elite object or a more humbler object, but it's something that speaks to use. And with the kinds of objects I'm charged with, these are things that people look at and admire, but they actually engaged with beyond just the visual. And so that's sort of an interpretive point I'm very keen to drive in, again, harnessing, accessing those lived experiences of these things as more than just what you see in the case or behind the ropes. But someone really did sit in that chair, probably knocked it over or threw something off the side the way they still do today. And chairs are really fun because you can see how often children learned how to walk by pushing on them. So they're worn in certain places and you can infer, all right, well, that's perhaps one explanation, but.
Thanks, it was perfect. And I do have a lot of ideas for these two questions. I don't know, see me afterwards if you want to talk more about this, whoever this is from. Cindy has a hand.
Hi, I'd just like to offer an opinion on the question, why are personal reflections more important than interpretive opinion? First of all, the personal reflection might already be an interpretation. However, if we take personal reflection to be an account of something, then that provides facts that the interpretation is based on. And the personal account is already the seed that provides the rest of the information that's developed. Not to say that the interpretation is also important because it contextualizes all the facts, which might not be in agreement with each other. So there's more than one way to ask the question. There's more than one way to answer that question. I imagine the questioner knew an answer before they asked the question. So just wanted to offer that comment.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. Here's another question. Coming from a living history and reenactment museum, how would you recommend respectfully reenacting the stories of enslaved people during the Revolutionary War? And that's a question for the room, people. Woo!
Thank you. Oh, God. Hi, everyone. So on my part, being the museum educator and public engagement associate, I want to make sure I know how to respectfully speak on this topic. We are a museum in Farmington, and there's so many really important figures and stories right from our area. And
my hesitation is that I just want to make sure that people feel comfortable hearing these stories, whether it's the students or the people telling them. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the matter, or if anyone has ideas or experience with this. Thank you.
Got it. So first of all, and I don't see her here, and I'm not going to name her to you, but you should check with folks at Central in the Public History Department. There's someone who has a good deal of expertise on this, and she would be your first call. And there are places that do this work and do it well, and I've been doing it for a while, and you probably are already at least looking at them as models. And I would continue to think about what's happening as folks interpret daily life on plantations in the area just outside of New York City, certainly. And there are a couple of really good groups, thought groups in the region looking at enslavement in the North and how to interpret those stories. And there are a couple of really interesting people who are tied to that, and we can chat afterwards to figure out email addresses and contacts and Instagram links for those folks. But yeah, this work is happening. It is possible to do. It is super tricky. There are lots of examples of it going totally awry. And I'm thinking of you, Indiana, when they did that really crazy sort of school lock-ins where you went into the fields and you pretended to be a runaway and you had to run and people chased you and screamed at you. And academics went to go test it out. Yeah, it was bad. It was a really bad idea. So don't do that. But there are lots of really good ways of doing this. And it does take some thought and some planning, but it is possible. So thanks for that.
Can I just say my question? You would be, are you going to go first person? Are they going to be in character, or is it third person in, you know, the dress of the time, and that's a presence and a visual, but you're not, you know, when you get a first person answer, I am X, Y, or Z. So I throw it to you just to think about, but there's, you know, there are pros and cons to both. I got my start in that sector of the museum world, so it's evolved over the years. I was at Williamsburg, you know, there's a lot of evolution there, right? So.
And here's one, where have you most recently faced opposition? I believe that's what that says. In the community, and how are you dealing with it?
So I am Cambodian, Buddhist. There's a Buddhist temple in Bristol, Connecticut. And a few years back, I reached out, and you know, we go to the temple probably like twice a year. And there was opposition of coming into the temple because they feels extractive, right? When you come in with a different hat. And so I joined the temple. And I've been there for the last like 2 years on doing a lot of the community organizing around our New Year's. But you know, Bong is honorific for an older brother. First thing he said to me is, "What is community?" And I think you have to define it by yourself and be a part of it. I identify as Cambodian and then Asian American, but I'm closer to the Asian American community until about 2 years ago when I got more embedded within the Cambodian American community. And those are elders. They're much older. They're about in their 70s to 80s and somewhere in their 50s. So I was learning how to take the criticism and hear people out and have those long conversations about what they want. And you know, with that generational gap, I lead the youth program. So my kids are 25 to like 18, and leading those that group, mostly young ladies, and advocating for them in these other spaces, and having to mediate. I think that was like the hardest thing I had to do in the last few years.
I guess I'll take that question and sort of geared towards our work. I don't think we've really run into much opposition to our work, and that's surprising. Our first exhibit that we put out in 2012, that was a tough story. We were talking about 16 young men that were enslaved and sent back to Europe, and we thought we'd get a lot of pushback from the Mayflower descendants. And we didn't. They came through, they saw it, and they were like, yeah, this is the history. We understand it too. Like, we're all reading the same documents. And we agree. They said we may have, maybe shed the Pilgrims in a little bit of a better light, but, we understand why you did what you did. So, and from there, it's been really welcome. I think we're at a different place. I really do. I think we're at a different place where people are hungry for the truth, and they're hungry for like fresh voices and opinions and images and colors and art. And so it's been really welcome all along.
Nice. We'll leave there on the upbeat. And just to note, in plain sight, kind of meme, a really nice memory of being moved by a label that said artist once known. And how we use the language and how we explain these things to visitors and allow people to make sense of what we're seeing and what we're wrestling with in the institution side is critically important. So pleased for that. Thank you all.
Quickly, April 13th, this Saturday, we're doing Cambodian New Year's at the Buddhist temple. Last year had over 900 people show up. This year, there's a flea market, live music, as well as a contemporary live Cambodian band that's going to be playing music from the 60s and 70s. It is open to all.
Now, thank you all. You've been amazing. See you on the floor.